Welcome to a Prevent Connect podcast, where we explore the prevention of violence against women. This is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault.
Hello everyone, this is Meghna Bhatt from Prevent Connect. I am so excited to be here today with Colby, Lenz, and Rachel Caidor. Our today's podcast will highlight the work that Survived and Punished has been accomplishing and envisioning to end the cycle of sexual and domestic violence and other forms of intersectional oppressions. So how are you doing, Rachel and Colby?
All right.
Good, thank you.
Doing well, excited to be here?
Yes.
Okay, great. To start with, please tell us a little bit about Survived and Punished and how it originated.
Sure. So I'll start and then turn to Rachel. But Survived and Punished basically is a coming together of various freedom campaigns for survivors of domestic and sexual violence who've been criminalized, and organizations who do work with incarcerated survivors. So basically, through conversations between the Campaign to Free Nan He, the Campaign to Free Maurice Alexander, and then Love and Protect, which Rachel will speak more to, and the California Coalition for Women Prisoners, we came together to see what could happen when we bring more people, more organizations, more force behind trying to build a movement to decarcerate and decriminalize survival.
And so I am based in Chicago, as you know, and so Chicago's chapter of Love and Protect, which came out of the Campaign to Free Maurice Alexander, the Chicago Alliance to Free Maurice Alexander. Once Maurice's case was sort of settled, we morphed into Love and Protect, which is a support committee rather than a defense committee. And members of Love and Protect had been working with members of Survived and Punished. So what happened a couple of years ago was there was a convening here in Chicago called the No Perfect Victims Convening that sort of brought the folks from California out to Chicago, and we started having sort of a larger conversation around the ways survivors of domestic violence specifically, but also sexual violence, are being criminalized for surviving. And so now this is a national network, and we're thinking through ways of whether and how to grow. But that's where we're at right now.
Wow. I'm sure all this collective organizing, community organizing hasn't happened overnight. I'm sure it needs a lot of, minds together, hands together, you know what I mean? Like you need all these different voices. And I think we've seen these conversations and, as I mentioned, community organizing revolving around this, especially these social justice movements and how it intersects to the cycle of gender violence. So the next question is, how do you see the criminalization of survival, either through the prison industrial complex or, we talk about school to prison pipeline, played a role in continuing the cycle of sexual and domestic violence?
Well, I think that we share sort of an idea that it's a multiple tiered situation. First of all, we know that people are experiencing violence inside the criminal legal system. And so we know that people are at risk for being sexually assaulted. We know overwhelmingly women, especially, or women identified people who are incarcerated, are often already survivors of sexual and domestic violence. And then that trauma is being compounded in a place where they're being made vulnerable, not only vulnerable to harm by other people that are incarcerated, but vulnerable to harm by the people who work there, guards, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that direct level. But what we also understand is that prisons themselves, the criminal legal system, is an inherently violent apparatus, right? And so we see that, especially those of us who work, in domestic violence and sexual violence, are really relying on a system that is based on power-based violence to solve a problem, addressing, impacting people who have already been impacted by power-based violence. And so it's continuing that cycle in sort of multiple ways and sort of keeping alive this idea in our society that somehow prison is a solution for either addressing the harm that someone has done and or keeping someone sort of locked away from the rest of the community where they actually can receive healing.
Wow. So I see this, the efforts or, I guess this vision of shifting from, the whole criminalization and the whole, prison as a solution to, deterring crime or any kind of this, but it's just going to be, it doesn't help in this whole cycle, right? It kind of contributes to that. And, but the question comes to is like, who has been the most affected in this never ending cycle of criminalization and gender violence?
Yeah, and we believe, and it's backed up by statistics, that women of color in particular, and trans women of color in particular, have been most impacted by this intersection of criminalization and gender violence, racial violence, and this continued cycle of the abuse, both, as Rachel was saying, in what we see as more intimate partner or community settings, as well as within the prison system, right? So all of this mimicking of these cycles of abuse and power, in this kind of endless cycle, right, that compounds all these forms of oppression, and certainly poor people, poor women, and gender nonconforming people and immigrants, both documented and undocumented. I think, and Rachel, you can add in, I think these are some of the main places where we see people most marginalized and disappeared into carceral systems.
And I think specifically in regard to survivors of intimate partner violence, domestic or sexual, people who end up appealing to, like, having to defend themselves physically from harm are often people that have tried, have moved through systems already, and those systems have failed them. And then when they are criminalized for self-defense, what it's also impacting is a community of survivors that recognizes that, like, when they, like, A, these systems are not built to protect them, and B, that when they do something to protect themselves, like, this very system that we're told to appeal to is what's going to cause them the most harm. And so it, like, I think that, like, a third layer of people impacted are those of us who are in the social services, who then have to grapple with this contradiction of asking survivors to appeal to a system that will indeed punish them for surviving.
So as I mentioned, I know the Prevent Connect is largely focused on primary prevention of sexual and domestic violence. So how do you see primary prevention playing a role in this work?
Like, I think that those of us who do prevention education work, especially around sexual and domestic violence, need to really come to terms with the reality that we are, like, a lot of our prevention education is like rooted in a sort of like ignorance of how we understand addressing the harm, right? And so we do a lot of, like, bystander intervention, we do a lot of harm reduction, we do a lot of sort of like risk reduction things, but we don't talk about the fact that we are part of the people that put survivors in harm's way by exposing them to these systems. And that's where we have to be accountable, and that's where we have to really start thinking through whether we are an anti-violence movement, and then, like, how we're going to teach people prevention from there, or if we're a punishment or retribution movement, right? And if we are thinking about sexual violence, for example, as a crime of power and control, we can't really sort of help people dismantle ideas of power and control without talking about the fact that we use power and control ourselves to, quote unquote, heal or find justice. So that's a direct kind of prevention education thing, but there's also, like, helping people understand that we really have to be better about like intervening on the lives of survivors before it escalates to a point where they have to defend themselves physically. So what is going on in the way that we are talking to people about their experiences of harm that is making them, like, that's failing them, right? And that's not giving them sort of skills or safety nets to get out of or to sort of like minimize abusive systems, and also how not to be abusers, right? Like, we're also not focusing on the fact that, you know, all of these people who are incarcerated for surviving are victims of someone who themselves was probably a survivor themselves, right? And so we're not sort of educating people who may potentially be perpetrators in sort of like the ripple effect of what, like, power-based violence has on individuals and communities.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a lot of like I think some of the things that you've addressed is like the underlying risk factors that we kind of may fail to see or overlook while creating our prevention approaches or primary prevention programs. And I think also it's about, as you mentioned, dismantling the systemic oppression and tackling the root causes. That's going to help shift the culture by having these dialogues with our communities and our members and our family and friends.
Thank you for listening to this Prevent Connect podcast. Prevent Connect is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, with funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views presented on Prevent Connect are not necessarily the views of the United States government, the CDC, or CalCASA. To learn more about Prevent Connect, visit www.preventconnect.org. For more information about CalCASA's mission, or to show your support, visit calcasa.org. That's CalCasa.org.